I am your host, James Morgan, and this is History of Cities. Episode 14 Behind Every Great Man. We last left off with the death of Theodosius the Great, the last Roman emperor to rule over both the Eastern and Western empires. Following his last wishes, the empire was split between his two eldest sons, Honorius in the west and Arcadius in the east. The two boys had a few things in common. They were both young. Arcadius was 17 while Honorius was only 10. They were both weak-willed and perhaps not that interested in the hard work of ruling over a massive empire. As a result, they both came under the influence of more ambitious and clever men. Theodosius had assigned the son of a barbarian chieftain that was serving in his court as chief advisor and guardian to the two boys. This man, whose name was Stilicho, had married into the royal family and was principally focused on influencing the younger, Honorius, in Milan. His reach could not extend far enough to also control Arcadius in Constantinople, and so the elder brother came under the shadow of the malicious praetorian prefect named Rufinus. This was a dangerous man, whose ambition lay not on directing the empire from the shadows, but in claiming the title of emperor for himself. He was famous in the capital among the aristocracy for his exceptional greed, and carried a reputation for cruelty that led some contemporary historians to lay the blame of the Thessalonica massacre on his counsel. In the young Arcadius, Rufinus found his perfect puppet. The newly crowned Augustus was slow-witted, uncharismatic, and embodied none of the traits that people look for in their Roman emperors. Rufinus planned to have the emperor marry his daughter, and then it would only be a slip down the staircase or an unfortunate fall from a horse, and Rufinus would be able to step up and take the throne. Unfortunately for the ambitious prefect, he had a rival in the court that was working just as hard as he was to puppeteer the incompetent emperor. The other man that held sway in Arcadius's court was an elderly eunuch named Eutropius. In terms of appearance and temperament, Eutropius fit the stereotype for eunuchs precisely. He was bald, with pasty yellow skin, and as one of Arcadius's closest advisors, he was immensely clever and duplicitous, though not as depraved or cruel as Rufinus. Although he was driven by ambition like Rufinus, he did not want to be emperor, and it was quite clear that he would be the lesser of two evils if both advisors could not coexist. And it was certain that the two rivals could not coexist, and so Eutropius's main goal was to prevent the marriage between Rufinus's daughter and Arcadius, as that event would inevitably precipitate his exile or execution. So when Rufinus was called away to Antioch in the spring of 395, Eutropius took his chance to introduce Arcadius to a beautiful young lady named Eudoxia. The emperor fell in love instantly, and before Rufinus had even had the chance to try and protest, Eudoxia and Arcadius were married. The happy occasion was cut short by news that the Goths that had been given lands in the Balkans had risen up in revolt. This group of Goths had elected a young man named Alaric to be their new king and christened themselves the Visigoths. Alaric would go on to be one of the most famous figures in late Roman history, as his campaigns in the western portion of the empire effectively swept away the remnants of power that Rome had projected for centuries. But as we are more interested in the east, specifically in Constantinople, we will mainly focus on the first part of Alaric's career, which takes place just outside our city. The revolt of the Visigoths was made possible by two events. One was the climactic battle of the last civil war, and the other was the almost immediate death of Theodosius the Great afterwards. The battle had left both the western and eastern Roman armies in tatters, and far from the capital city. When the empire was split after Theodosius's death, Stilicho took effective control of the western empire and both armies. Now that there was no military force guarding the capital, or any of the eastern provinces, and a dim-witted young boy sat on the throne in Constantinople, the Visigoths saw an opportunity to raise their station by force. They had never been given the respect they thought they deserved from the Romans, and now that there was no one to stop them, they could take their grievances up with the emperor in person. Within a few weeks of declaring their uprising, the Visigoth army was only a few miles from Constantinople. With no hope of defending the city against such a massive army, Rufinus did the only thing that he could do and bribed the barbarian horde to leave them alone. Surprisingly, this worked, and Alaric marched his men back west to pillage the unprotected farmlands and villages of Macedonia. Knowing that they could not afford another bribe if the Visigoths returned, Arcadius ordered, or more likely begged, Stilicho to send the eastern army back to the capital so that they could defend against Alaric. Stilicho thought it would have been silly to march an army past the pillaging barbarians to reach the capital, so he set out from his base in Milan with both the western and eastern Roman armies to confront Alaric in the field. This change-up terrified the court of Constantinople more than the Visigoths did, as if Stilicho defeated Alaric in battle, he would then be able to march unopposed to the capital and declare himself ruler of both the western and eastern halves of the empire. In desperation, Arcadius ordered Stilicho to come no further and to send the eastern army ahead without him. Unexpectedly, he complied with this order and turned the western army around to head back to Milan, while the eastern forces continued on to Constantinople. When they arrived at the gates of the city, Rufinus made a big show of mingling with the troops, hoping that he could solicit their support to strengthen his position in court after he had lost the marriage battle to Eutropius. What Rufinus did not know was that the clever eunuch had already approached the army's commander, a man named Gallienus, with a proposed alliance. So as Rufinus moved among the soldiers, they moved so that they stood between him and the gate, until without warning they drew their blades and hacked the ambitious prefect to pieces. Now that Rufinus was dead, there was no one standing in Eutropius's way, and he quickly worked to bend the emperor, and by extension the Eastern Empire, to his will. During his time as sole advisor to Arcadius, corruption was rampant, even more than it had been under the greedy Rufinus. Also, despite the fact that there was a barbarian army still rampaging freely around Greece, Arcadius's policies took a dramatic turn towards promoting civil bureaucracy at the expense of the military. This, combined with the fact that both he and Eutropius saw Stilicho as a greater threat to their authority than Alaric, meant that the Visigoth king went largely untouched for 4 years. The shunning of traditionally predominant military officers and the lack of action on the Gothic front made the imperial court very unpopular, and people knew who exactly was to blame. The problem was, even if Arcadius wanted to get rid of Eutropius, he was simply not mentally equipped to defeat the cunning eunuch. Luckily, multiple factors would come together in the year 399 that were collectively enough to pry away Eutropius' stranglehold over the emperor. The first domino was tipped by Eutropius himself, when, in his arrogance, he overstepped the bounds of acceptable conduct in an unprecedented way. He managed to have Arcadius name him consul for the year 399. Now, since the days of the Roman Republic, the consulship had steadily lost its power, but it still remained the most prestigious and sought-after title for those outside of the imperial family. At no time in history had the office of consul been given to a former slave, much less an emasculated one, but now Eutropius had broken that seal. Expectedly, the appointment of Eutropius caused widespread rebellions throughout the Eastern Empire, and the Western Empire outright refused to recognize him. The most important of these rebellions was yet another Gothic one. This time, a group known as the Ostrogoths, that had been settled in Asia Minor, gathered their banners in revolt. Their reasons for breaking their oaths to the Roman Empire are given as they were upset for not being duly rewarded for their participation in past Roman military campaigns, and they were disgusted by Eutropius' influence in the court. The second reason is highly questionable, as it doesn't make much sense that the Ostrogoths would be very concerned about some random eunuch holding the title of consul. And even more dubious was the fact that the source that brought this demand to Arcadius was Gallienus, a high-ranking general and court rival of Eutropius. As I already mentioned, Gallienus had previously worked with Eutropius to have his men murder Rufinus, but when the eunuch took power and started sidelining the army, Gallienus was alienated. Before the Ostrogoth rebellion, the general had very little power in the imperial court, especially compared to Eutropius. But the crisis in Asia Minor offered an opportunity for the military star to rise again. At first, Eutropius tried to organize the quelling of the rebellion himself, and sent an army under his hand-picked leader, a man named Leo, to put down the Ostrogoths. Leo was soundly defeated, and a little crack was made in the bubble Eutropius had erected around the emperor. Gallienus took this chance to squeeze himself through the crack, and convinced Arcadius to send another army, this time under his command, to stop the Goths. When Gallienus' army reached the eastern side of the Bosporus, he suspiciously made no move to engage the Ostrogoth army that was pillaging up and down Anatolia. It was at this point Gallienus reported back to Arcadius that they could not possibly defeat the Ostrogoths on the battlefield, and it would be more prudent to concede to their humble demand of having Eutropius removed from power. While the grip of Eutropius had been weakened by recent events, the emperor was still hesitant to remove his most trusted advisor. At this point, another person who had previously been relegated to the sidelines took this chance to try and pull at the emperor's strings. The Empress Eudoxia, whom Arcadius adored, owed everything she had to Eutropius, who had plucked her from obscurity and lifted her to be the most powerful woman in the empire. But she had outgrown the eunuch, and now sought to make her own place, directing the emperor to her will. With the goading of Eudoxia, Arcadius finally relented and had Eutropius banished to the island of Cyprus. The people of Constantinople rejoiced at the expulsion of the hated puppet master and the end of the Ostrogoth crisis. Except it wasn't the end of the Ostrogoth crisis, because surprise, surprise, the Goths didn't really care that Eutropius had been removed. It had all been a trick by Gaianus and Eudoxia to oust a court rival, and now the Ostrogoth army was in Chalcedon, just across the Bosporus Strait from Constantinople. Here Gaianus joined forces with his Gothic brethren and marched unimpeded into the capital. Constantinople and the emperor were now completely at the mercy of Gaianus and his barbarian army. The traitorous Goth wasted no time in getting rid of his remaining rivals in court and recalling Eutropius from Cyprus so that he could have him executed. Now one might assume that the Ostrogoths would have common cause with the Visigoths. After all, they had both rebelled against the empire for similar reasons, and they were, at least in the eyes of their enemies, one and the same people. However, Gaianus knew that Alaric and his people would never accept him as their sovereign, and so he made moves to redirect Alaric's focus westward. In order to placate the Visigoths, Arcadius had given Alaric control of the province of Pannonia. Now that Gaianus was in power, he stripped Alaric of his command and gave Pannonia to the Western Empire. This ploy worked surprisingly well, as Alaric believed that the political situation in Constantinople no longer offered any possibility of profit, and so he prepared to deal with the West, either by diplomacy or force. Meanwhile, in the capital, Gaianus was facing the possibility of a popular revolt. The people of the city were encouraged by the Patriarch of Constantinople to overthrow the barbarian government and purge the city of the foreign element. On the 12th of July in the year 400, Gaianus and his men were forced to flee the city. Less fortunate were the thousands of innocent Goths that had been living in the city for years that were slaughtered by the bloodthirsty mob. The fleeing Goths were chased by a nearby Roman army and defeated in 2 consecutive battles, ending the Ostrogoth threat in the east for the foreseeable future. It is at this point that I would like to go over the life and career of the Patriarch of Constantinople, whose words roused the people of the city to throw out the barbarian invaders and unfortunately massacre innocent civilians in the process. This man was named John Chrysostom, and he was born in Antioch in the year 347 during the reign of Valens. His mother was a pagan, and his father was a higher-up in the Roman military apparatus, who died during John's early childhood. Due to his late father's status and some connections that his mother had, John was able to procure an education from one of the most famous teachers of his day, a Greek pagan named Libanius. I would like to point out that while Greek literature and philosophy had always been highly regarded by the Romans, during this period of the East's total ascendancy and the West's decline, Latin language and teaching was completely eclipsed in the lands ruled by Constantinople. John was a star pupil, and he devoured the classical Greek writings with relish. Additionally, he was a gifted speaker and lawyer, but his true love lay in Christianity. John had been baptized when he was either 14 or 19, likely because though his mother wasn't Christian, it was an easy way to improve one's station. John wasn't just an opportunistic convert, though. He left his studies under Libanius to fully commit himself to the Word of God at the School of Antioch. During his studies, John underwent physical, mental, and spiritual trials by following a strict ascetic lifestyle and spending 2 years as a hermit, without sitting, sleeping, barely eating, and devoting his entire time to memorizing the Bible. This lifestyle wreaked havoc on John's body, and he was forced to return to Antioch and take up a more normal career in the church. The downside of this change was that now, on top of trying to understand the Word of God, John also had to deal with church politics, which were at this time just as hectic as ever. He was first ordained as a deacon by the Bishop of Antioch, the man Theodosius had appointed to that position, who was named Meletius. John's new boss was a controversial figure, to say the least, and Meletius owned his position largely to the fact that he was a rabid supporter of orthodoxy against Arian heresy, which still had strong allies in Antioch. However, John was able to stay largely untouched by the political upheavals during his tenure in Antioch, and mainly focused on preaching his particular brand of populist Christianity that stressed charity, avoiding greed, and the misuse of material power. His first 12 years of exceptional oratory is what likely earned him the epithet Chrysostom, which means golden mouth. It also brought him to the attention of powerful members of the imperial court. In the year 397, Eutropius convinced the emperor to name John the Archbishop of Constantinople. It was an odd choice, as John's zealous asceticism clashed with the traditionally corrupt and extravagant ways of the capital. Being Archbishop of one of the most important Christian cities also meant that John could no longer avoid the political side of church matters, and he immediately alienated himself from the power players in both the secular and spiritual circles. Where he did cultivate support was among the common people of Constantinople, and to the surprise of his rivals, he was able to leverage this relationship to get himself out of a number of sticky situations. His first great trial came when two of his most powerful opponents made common cause. One was the Patriarch of Alexandria, a man named Theophilus. As the leader of one of the greatest Christian cities in the East, Theophilus was intent on undermining the influence of Constantinople to raise his own city to prominence. John's second opponent was the Empress Eudoxia, who had been at odds with the Archbishop from the start. She is famous as the first in a long tradition of extravagant and, let's say, morally loose empresses. It is no wonder that she took it very personally when John began preaching in the churches of the capital, decrying the decadence and corruption of the elites. So in 403, Eudoxia and Theophilus held a council of John's enemies and successfully had him stripped of his position and exiled from Constantinople. But John had God and the people on his side. As soon as word got out that their beloved archbishop had been wrongfully denigrated, the population of the capital began rioting in the streets. This combined with the act of divine retribution that caused an earthquake to shake the city the night after John was exiled, which made the empress beg Arcadius to reverse his sentence and bring John back. Upon his return, John took the shortness of his punishment to mean that he was untouchable by the perfidious empress, and so he made no attempt at softening his rhetoric. It all came to a head again just a few months later, when Eudoxia had a silver statue in her likeness erected outside Hagia Sophia. This was blatantly meant as an insult to John personally, as he was the Archbishop of Constantinople, and thus Hagia Sophia was his home. The desecration of his holy abode sent John into a fresh tirade of oratory, condemning the empress, which caught the ire of her devoted husband Arcadius. So once again John was banished and disbarred, and once again riots broke out in Constantinople. This time, the unrest led to the center of Christendom in the capital, the great Hagia Sophia, being burned down. Even more disconcerting was the way in which God intervened this time. Less than 4 months after John left Constantinople, Eudoxia had a miscarriage and died. Unfortunately for John, these tragedies were not enough to sway the emperor this time, and he spent the rest of his days in exile, pleading with the Pope and other high-ranking bishops to intercede on his behalf. Then, in 407, while journeying through the Caucasus, John died. His legacy is one of both good and evil Christian ideas. John's absolutist moral views on the Word of God challenged prevailing sentiments of corruption and avarice among church and secular officials. He championed the common people and spoke eloquently on the preeminent practice of love between all Christians. On the other hand, his inflexibility and general disdain for those that did not fit his narrow moral vision led to him inspiring a great deal of bigotry and persecution. Groups that he particularly railed against, such as Jews and homosexuals, would in the future be treated horrifically by the church. In the end, John became what every moral leader becomes, a breaking point within a group he sought to purify. The most important contemporary breaking point that John personally contributed to was the schism between the Eastern and Western Empire. When he roped the Pope and other Western bishops into his political struggle in Constantinople, he created an opportunity for disagreement. When papal emissaries attempted to enter the capital to intercede on John's behalf, they were arrested and sent away. This insult was one of many hairline fractures that would eventually expand into a full-blown schism between Rome and Constantinople. But for the time being, the two sides of the Roman Empire would have other matters to deal with, as the West spirals ever downward with successive crises, and in the East, less than a year after the passing of John Chrysostom, Arcadius would die at the age of 31. His crown would pass to his 7-year-old son, Theodosius II, who unfortunately would be more like his father than the grandfather he was named after. You can hardly blame Theodosius. After all, he was just a child, but it was obvious that someone else needed to take charge, at least until the boy was old enough to think for himself. But who was left to step up and take the position of de facto ruler of Constantinople? By the time Arcadius died in 408, the list of power players that had defined his reign was looking downright destitute. Let's go through the roles. Rufinus, dead. Eutropius, dead. Eudoxia, dead. Gaianus, dead. John Chrysostom, dead. So who in the court held enough power to dictate the fate of the empire? Well, at the start it was a praetorian prefect named Anthemius. He had been the second most powerful person in the East since the death of Eudoxia in 404, though he was really the most powerful since Arcadius was such a pushover. Anthemius' career was a welcome respite from the scheming and backstabbing of the previous decades, and he is rarely talked about in the great dramatizations of Byzantine history because he ran a respectable and thus boring administration. Though not glorious or tragic, the prefect oversaw a number of necessary reforms. On the diplomatic front, he procured a more solid peace agreement with the Persians and avoided a civil war with the Western Empire. On the domestic front, he revised both the tax and grain system to improve imperial revenue and prevent famines in the capital. His claim to fame, however, unfairly bears the name of the young emperor he presided over. It was Anthemius, not the infant sovereign, who commissioned the awe-inspiring Theodosian walls. The walls were a double line of fortifications stretching northwards from a marble tower on the coast of the Marmara Sea, over the 7th and 6th hill of Constantinople, until terminating at the prisons of Anamis that overlook the Golden Horn, which is the inlet that acts as the natural barrier on Constantinople's northern flank. They were about 2 kilometers from the previous main fortifications of the capital, the Constantinian walls. The city had long ago outgrown these original walls, and the constant threat of barbarian invasion made building a new defensive line imperative. The total length of the walls was about 6 kilometers, and they were perforated by 9 main gates and a smattering of smaller entrances. Of these, I will only highlight one, the Golden Gate. This portal was used only on special occasions, such as coronations or triumphal military victories, by the imperial court. To be allowed to enter Constantinople through the Golden Gate was one of the rarest and highest honors in antiquity. Besides the gates, the walls were completely impassable. The great inner wall was between 4.5 and 6 meters thick and 12 meters high, made of limestone and dotted with 96 towers. These towers were between 15 and 20 meters tall and varied in shape. A few meters from the inner wall, and terraced on a lower level, was the outer wall. This structure ran the whole length of the inner wall, but was considerably thinner and shorter. It too had a number of towers, but these were smaller and were either square or crescent-shaped. Just because the outer wall was not as grand as its counterpart does not mean that it was any less formidable to an invading force, and it was seldom breached during a siege. A bit further out from the outer wall was a moat, again terraced to be lower than the base of the outer wall. The moat was 20 meters wide and 10 meters deep. Contrary to popular depictions, it was never filled with water. This would have been a completely unnecessary waste of water, and it was much more practical to let the rain turn the bottom of the moat into mud that would hinder the movement of any hostile forces trying to cross it. While stuck in the mud, they would be easy pickings for archers on the walls. Beyond the practical purpose of the walls and their architectural significance, they also provide a useful historical mark. A cardinal sin of historians is trying to fit the chaos and interconnectivity of historical events into nice, neat little boxes. Still, we can't help ourselves, and even if sometimes things get left on the cutting room floor, it is important to compartmentalize things so that they are easier to digest. It is for that purpose that historians like to divide history into eras and ages, like the Stone Age or the Modern Age or the Classical era. Sometimes, different scholars will have different opinions on when these periods start and when they end. For the Middle Ages, or Medieval era, we can use the Theodosian walls as bookends. Most historians put the start of the Middle Ages around the year 476 with the fall of the Western Roman Empire, but we can fudge that a bit to say the start line lies in 413 with the completion of the Theodosian walls. Now the end line is even muddier, with various times between 1400 and 1500 being set as the end of the Middle Ages and the start of the early modern period. I personally like the year 1453, when the Ottomans crossed the Theodosian walls and took Constantinople. This way, we can say that the Middle Ages lasted as long as the Theodosian walls kept the Christian stronghold of Constantinople safe from non-Christian invaders. I have to add that non-Christian caveat in, because though the walls were impervious to physical harm, they did not keep Constantinople untouched for their entire existence. But that is a story for another time. That is also to say, they were only impervious to physical harm from mortal hands, as they needed to be constantly repaired after God's will sent numerous earthquakes and floods to test their strength. Prefect Anthemius would not have long to appreciate his stunning contribution to Constantinople. Only a year after the Theodosian walls were completed, their creator dropped out of the history books. It is unknown if at this time he was simply dismissed, or if he died, but the gap his departure left allowed someone with bluer blood to finally give imperial legitimacy back to the Eastern Empire. No, it was not Theodosius II, who was still only 13 years old, but instead his sister, who took up the reins of leadership. The new empress's name was Pulcheria, and she was the eldest surviving child of Arcadius and Eudoxia. Though only 2 years older than her brother, she had a much stronger will and much sharper mind. Unlike her mother, Pulcheria did not partake in the decadent and immoral lifestyle that is stereotypically attributed to Byzantine empresses. She was, by all accounts, an extremely pious and restrained aristocrat. Her most defining characteristic, at least to the men of the time, was the vow of virginity she and her sisters took. This vow was often used as propaganda to emphasize the moral heights of the imperial family, and given many times as an example of why God's grace seemed to fall like rain on the Eastern Empire. Pulcheria was certainly not against this depiction of herself, as her devout faith was a cornerstone of her political agenda. She presided over most administrative duties of the imperial court, but she was especially involved in matters of an ecclesiastical nature. Her desire for power and the efficient way she wielded it meant that even though Theodosius was not as dim-witted or ineffectual as his father, Pulcheria remained the de facto ruler of the empire long after her brother came of age. Theodosius did not dislike this arrangement, as his interest principally lay in the pursuit of knowledge and the creation of art. He was most happy when illustrating a natural setting, hunting, sporting, or studying classical literature and mathematics. Who needs the stress and responsibility of being emperor when life had so many pleasures? Around Theodosius' 19th birthday, he finally decided it was time to grow up and take this emperor thing a bit more seriously. His first step into adulthood was not taking more responsibility on the policy-making side of his imperial prerogative, but the social side. It was time for him to find a wife. Or more specifically, it was time for Pulcheria to find him a wife. She quickly found him what she felt was the perfect match. Her choice was a young, beautiful, and bright girl of Greek descent. The girl had come to Constantinople from her home in Athens with just 100 coins to her name, as her father had willed the bulk of his wealth to his sons. She had felt cheated and was urged by her aunt to seek out the help of the emperor. This is how the young Athanes first met Pulcheria. The empress saw in Athanes a perfect protege. She was exceptionally intelligent, much like Pulcheria, and she had no real wealth of her own, so she was a non-threat to Pulcheria's power. As a cherry on top, Athanes was the picture of the ideal Hellenic woman, which was all the rage in the Eastern Empire at that time. Unfortunately, this Hellenism also included paganism, but that was quickly remedied, and Athanes was baptized into the Christian church before marrying Theodosius. Upon her rebirth into the one true faith, Athanes was rechristened as Eudoxia, which is like Eudoxia but with a C instead of an X. To make matters even more difficult for us, she also had a daughter, whom she named Eudoxia. If you are confused by the names in this narrative, just know that you are not alone, and there is a long tradition of historians getting massive migraines when studying royal lineages. Upon the birth of the imperial couple's first child, the aforementioned Eudoxia, Theodosius raised his wife to the rank of Augusta. This irked Pulcheria, as now the woman she had intended to be her pretty little student was now her peer. Soon enough, these two empresses will be joined in Constantinople by a third, the daughter of Theodosius the Great and Augusta of the West, Placidia. At one point, these three women will hold all power in the Roman Empire, though they will have to do it standing behind either their brother, son, or husband. The saying really is true that behind every great man there is a woman, but we will have to pick that up next time, so please join me in the following episode, where we will explore the age of the three empresses. As always, if you have any questions or think I missed anything, please feel free to email me at hofcpod.cast@gmail.com or DM me on Twitter at hofc_podcast. Thank you for listening to this episode, and please join me next time for the history of Constantinople.